We're going to talk about persecution and how it can be stopped. Now, there was a Muslim mob who stoned a Christian woman to death, and a persecution watchdog has sent this message to President Biden of the US. Persecution watchdog warned that Biden's administration's decision to remove Nigeria from the countries of particular concern list would have ramifications for Christians. The US government has been under increased scrutiny over its decision last year, which removed Nigeria from the list, especially after, this past month, a Muslim mob fatally stoned Deborah Emmanuel Yakubu, a 25-year-old Christian college student, to death on May the 12th. Experts ponder why Nigeria was removed as persecution intensified inside the African nation. We are puzzled by this, said David Curry. What do you think it is? Is it because it's persecution of Christians that's the problem?
Muslims are not going to Muslims.
If there were persecution of Muslims, do you think it would have been a different reaction and Nigeria would have been high up on the list of persecuting countries?
No, because certainly the north of Nigeria, the northern half of Nigeria, is intensely Islamic.
Yeah, that's my point. You see, let's take another country's example. In China, there's a big minority up in the northwest called the Uyghurs.
Yes.
And they are Muslim.
Yes.
And it's noted that they are persecuted by the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And this is condemned repeatedly by the US administration.
Is China a country of concern?
That's a good question. Perhaps our research department could look that up, because I don't know the answer to that. Is China a country of particular concern?
There is a list designated by the United States Secretary of State. This seems to be a United Nations thing,
okay, right.
But it is controlled by the American Secretary of State. There's a list of about 15, I would say, and contained within the list is China, but also Nigeria, obviously North Korea, Pakistan, Russia, Vietnam, Burma.
That's interesting, because the talk was of Nigeria being removed from a list. Maybe that exact list.
Well, that must be the list. With the talk about Nigeria being possibly removed. It goes back as far as 2018, probably goes back further.
But China is on there as well. That was the point we were making.
Yes.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? The point that I'm asking is it because they're Christians that there's a lack of concern? We don't know, I guess. We don't know the answer to that.
No, I don't know.
Now, David Curry, who is CEO of Open Doors USA, so a missionary organisation, said that removing the designation, which pinpoints nations with severe religious freedom violations, would cause more calamity and persecution, because the Nigerian government has done nothing to resolve the problem. They do not sufficiently protect, and this is the point I'm going to bring to you now, they don't protect civilian soft spots like churches. Because the Nigerian government has done nothing, that means they should be back as a country of particular concern. So is this really the issue? It may not be a Christian-Muslim thing. It's the fact that certain places, in this case churches, are going to be targeted. Therefore, you could put measures in place to make sure that it's harder to carry out these attacks.
Yes, I think so. And I think you mentioned about being employed in a Jewish school and how in that school you were protected. There were
there was heavy protection. There were guards on the gate.
Was that placed by the Jewish?
Yeah, it was done by the Jewish
owners of the school. It was a private school, presumably.
Yeah, it was a private school in the state sector, but yes, it was their own private security guards.
Was it a paying school?
No, it wasn't a paying school. No, you don't have to pay. You didn't have to pay
to get in there.
No, because it was a particular exemption. It's a religious school, but it taught the full national curriculum, so it was part of the state sector. Yeah.
Right, but if there had been an Islamic school, would the same thing have happened?
There was the Islamic school down the road. They weren't being subject to persecution, so I don't know of any special...
That's interesting.
Jews particularly seem to get the wage in this. The Jewish school isn't in China, the Jewish school is in England.
See.
Now, in China, there was other issues. When I was living in China, there were other issues with security. But the way that the government would deal with that is, if there were any violence or problems with persecution or just violent crime, I noted they would behave differently. There was a series of knife attacks in universities in China, and so the government rounded up people who might have done it sort of person who might have carried out these knife attacks. They were in the right place, but they didn't know they'd done it. They didn't have evidence against them. And then they executed them all.
Oh, my.
In public, in a big football stadium.
Right.
And then the attack stopped. Not necessarily because they got the people, because people thought,
it was only that they guessed that they could possibly have
yes,
been
and they thought, well, if I start again, they'll do it again until they find me. And so they're very, very heavy-handed, but on the other hand, effective in their protection of people. But, of course, it does involve its own prejudice in that rounding up the usual suspects. And I think that the same is true with the Uyghurs. It's not necessarily that there's a systematic persecution. There is a problem with the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs, but they distrust them because they're Muslims, so therefore not under their control. And so there might be a violent attack. If there's a violent attack, they use the same method for Muslims.
They don't like indoctrination.
Unless it's their own. They like indoctrination, just only their own. Now, this is an interesting point, because we could take this further. Could we argue then that in a free country, there's a limit to what you can do to stop persecution?
Yes. We try in our country. But very often we don't know that it's going to happen.
So if there's an attack, you can't stop it because you're allowing people freedom of movement.
That's right.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's a play of one principle against another. You don't want the violence to happen, but you don't want people to have their freedom curtailed. Now, we could take that in another direction, other decisions that are made where you balance freedom against whatever you're trying to prevent. I noted where I spent some time in Singapore. Now, Singapore was a very controlled society to the extent that you weren't allowed to bring chewing gum into the... You're not allowed to chew gum there because you might leave marks on the pavement, I believe.
All right.
This is, of course, terrible.
That's because you can't prevent people throwing it down on the pavement.
Yes, you can't have it. So they seem to give up their freedom in order to be rich, because if you've got good control, you're then safe for people to trade there. And it's famous for its huge shopping malls and basically a centre of retail and commerce. So Singapore became very wealthy on the basis of this, but traded away their freedom. Certainly at the time, this is a few years since I've been there, I think have changed. But, so would you say in this country, Beryl, that we've got the balance right?
No.
Which way do you think it's erring then? Too much freedom or too much control?
I'd want to be selective about the period of time that I'm talking about.
Okay.
And I dare say you can guess what
yes.
what period of time I'm thinking of.
Well, I think of a very recent period of time when we were locked down in our homes, for example.
Although I believe the Chinese were a lot more overprotective.
We've been criticising the Chinese, though that was just an example. Yeah. In this country, the balance seemed to be forgotten that we'd held on to. Has it been lost forever, though? That's the question. This balance between freedom and protection, safety, security.
Well, I heard someone say today, and I think I agree with them, that they'd never have dreamed that a Conservative like Boris Johnson would have shut down the country like he did.
Now, a lot of people did say that, believing, because he's got the label Conservative, that Boris Johnson is conservative in his politics or beliefs. I didn't see any sign of that. So I wasn't surprised that he would do it. That a Conservative government went along with it is surprising. And this problem, going back to the Nigerian situation, in Nigeria, if you were to stop any attacks, what would you need to do? You need to really clamp down. You can't have Muslims gathering together. It was a Muslim attack.
No.
Would we be okay with that?
You wouldn't be able to use weapons.
Yeah.
Well, we've got quite good gun control in this country.
Yes,
but
very strict
they
gun
can't
laws,
stop young men using knives.
No.
Because you need knives to be able to cut up food and so on. Although it's an offence to carry a blade, you can't stop knives and blades being sold.
Having a law against it doesn't stop it. The final point that I would make is just about a subtopic we've talked about on here before, hegemony, a country overreaching its legitimate authority and effectively bullying other countries. If America is being called upon to have Nigeria on this list, isn't that it interfering in the way Nigeria, a sovereign country, runs its own affairs?
Yes, I certainly think it is. And unfortunately, America does seem to want to control what other countries do.
What they do, what they think, what they believe.
But surely it should be down to Nigeria to control itself.
Yes. I think that the solution to such things, in this case, attack the root cause of what's happening. In this case, it's because of the teachings of Islam that the attack was carried out. The attack shouldn't be physical on Muslims at all. It should be to respond by education about what Islam teaches and showing that Islam is a false religion. Now, it works particularly well with Islam because Islam's sacred texts are so self-contradictory, immoral by today's standards in the teachings, that immediately they seem ridiculous to contemporary listeners once people realise what's actually in it. And to hold it up to the light, to be able to see what Islam is actually teaching, would, I think, a way of stopping this, because many, many young Muslims are turning away from the faith because of this. You know, the reason for that is they can look these things up on the internet and say,
yes.
You know, it used to be able to be, you could deceive people into not realising. But we started off with a Muslim example, but not just Muslims. If you attack the root cause of the behaviour, then policing isn't necessary. I think that's the way forward.
Yes,
But of course,
yes.
it's a lot of hard work.
What would you do, though, with countries that believe very strongly in Islam? What kind of thing would you teach them? You might get beheaded if you tried to teach them Christianity. Would
Yes.
you teach them something like the Golden Rule?
No, that wouldn't help. The reason why that wouldn't help is that's a very good rule. It's a principle in isolation. What they believe in is in Islam and in Muhammad. Now, in this country, there are many Muslims, just as there are Christians, who don't really know what Islam teaches at all, and they're not going to be doing these terrible things because they don't even know about it. And anyway, they're better people than Muhammad was, so they're not going to be following his footsteps. Muhammad himself is meant to be the supreme example of how a human should behave, or a man should behave. And so his behaviour, which was so terrible, is one that you need to hold up and show how awful he is. And there's a huge percentage of people, in fact Muslim apologists themselves, have referred to it as an avalanche of apostasy amongst the young. So in those countries, you don't need to go in where you could be beheaded. People have the internet. And even if the people within the country fondly believe that young people don't have the internet, they can use a VPN, a virtual private network, and bypass the censors. So they can't stop it, I don't think. But what doesn't help is when leaders say, well, no, actually, Islam is a religion of peace, when they know nothing about it. And they don't know that Islam, its actual teachings, are not about peace at all. Islam doesn't mean peace, as is sometimes being suggested. It means submission. You have to be obedient to Allah. Again, we're talking about Islam because that was the example we used, but whatever the root causes of the bad behaviour is where you should aim your attack, because once you can change people's ways of thinking, and we'll come back to this in the next story, but once you can change people's way of thinking, then you can change everything. And of course in the Bible it teaches that the crucial change is when the Holy Spirit renews your mind. The Apostle Paul talks about this in his letter to the Romans. So when I'm talking about teaching people and attacking the root cause, I do think that belief in Jesus and being filled with the Holy Spirit is part of this.
Yes.
So I think missionaries have their place.
Oh, yes, certainly, yes. Not so easy these days, because it seems missionaries, it's classed under proselytism,
Yes.
and that's the last thing, it seems, many countries want.
Yes, well, you said these days there, but I think it was always thus. You know, people never wanted them there. There was always the possibility that you wouldn't return if you went as a missionary. If you think of the early missionaries to China, they were all killed. And many missionaries to Africa would take their own coffin with them so that they could be sent back, pay in advance and take your own coffin, because so many of them died and would need to be shipped out. And yet they went anyway.
Yes.
It's a real challenge to us. This Islamic incident, you know, I'm not picking on Islam, that happens to be the one in the news, but basically beliefs that cause violence.
Yes.
Or behaviours that cause violence. We need to attack them at the root cause, and the root cause is a cause of the heart. They need a change of heart.
Yes.
And so I think the main response is to have everyone be believing Christians. That in itself seems prejudice, unless you listen to the argument that leads up to it, that it is this change of heart that results in the change of behaviour, which then results
because
in
the
lack of
heart
violence.
is the seat of the emotions.
Yep, and the seat of your will, or your decisions that you make. So that's my take on it, but do let us know.